The Tampa sun blazed down on the courthouse steps that morning, a relentless Florida heat that seemed to dare anyone to challenge its authority. Inside, the air was cooler but no less charged, the kind of stillness that hums with anticipation before a storm breaks. Pam Bondi strode through the heavy wooden doors, her heels clicking against the polished floor, like the opening salvo of a battle no one saw coming. She was a force. Blonde hair pulled back tight, eyes sharp as a hawk's, briefcase swinging in one hand, while the other smoothed the lapel of her navy blazer. This was supposed to be a routine hearing, a business dispute she could argue blindfolded, the kind of case that barely stirred the pulse of a seasoned attorney like her. But fate had other plans. The courtroom smelled of old wood and older rules, a sanctum where justice was supposed to reign, but often bowed to the egos behind the bench. Pam felt the weight of eyes on her as she approached the defendant's table, spectators sparse but curious, a bailiff chewing the inside of his cheek, a clerk pretending not to watch. And then there was Judge Alan Prescott, perched high in his black robe like a vulture, sizing up its next meal. His reputation preceded him. No nonsense, iron-fisted, the kind of man who ran his courtroom like a fiefdom. But today, his gaze didn't meet hers. It locked onto something else, a glint of gold just below her collarbone. A simple cross necklace, unassuming, personal, hers. The air shifted, a ripple of tension so subtle you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. Prescott cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the quiet like a gavel's echo. "Miss Bondi," he began, his voice a blade wrapped in velvet, "I must remind you that religious symbols have no place in my courtroom." Pam didn't flinch. She'd faced down tougher men than this, prosecutors, criminals, politicians, but this was new. Not a legal argument, not a point of procedure, but a direct strike at something she wore close to her heart. "You're wearing a cross that violates the neutrality of this space," he pressed, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing as if daring her to defy him. "Remove it, or face a fine." A murmur skittered through the room. Soft gasps from the handful of spectators, the bailiff shifting his weight, the clerk's pen freezing mid-scribble. Pam stood still, her expression cool as marble. This wasn't about a necklace. This was about control, about a judge flexing his power over something as small as a piece of jewelry, because he could. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, deliberate. "But my cross is no different than a wedding ring or a locket with a family photo inside." It was a simple truth, but it landed like a gauntlet thrown down in the dust. Prescott's face didn't change, unreadable, carved from stone, but his sigh carried the weight of impatience. "That's not how I see it," he replied, his tone clipped, final. "Either remove it, or I'll issue a fine for disregarding courtroom neutrality." The word hung there. Neutrality, like a shield he could hide behind. Pam didn't move. She didn't reach for the clasp. Instead, she folded her hands over her briefcase, her lips pressing into a thin line. The fine hit her like a slap. $50, $100. It didn't matter. It wasn't the money. It was the principle. For the first time in her career, Pam Bondi found herself penalized, not for breaking a rule, not for stepping out of line, but for daring to be herself in a space that demanded conformity. The room held its breath. The bailiff looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The clerk darted a glance between them, caught in the crossfire of a standoff no one had scripted. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a line in the sand, drawn by a judge who thought he could silence her with a flick of his pen. But Pam Bondi wasn't built to bend. She'd spent years fighting for justice in courtrooms just like this one, clawing her way through a system that didn't always welcome women like her. Smart, unapologetic, fearless. And now, over a cross? This wasn't about religion to her. It was about freedom, about the right to stand as you are without some petty tyrant stripping it away. Outside, America churned on, divided, loud, wrestling with its soul. Inside these walls, that fight boiled down to one woman, one judge, and one moment that was about to ignite something bigger than either of them could predict. Prescott thought he'd won, thought his fine would cow her into submission. He didn't know Pam Bondi. He didn't know she was about to turn his courtroom into a battlefield, and his own words into the weapon that would undo him. The echo of Judge Prescott's fine still lingered in the Tampa courtroom, a sharp note of authority that hadn't yet faded when Pam Bondi decided she'd had enough. The air crackled with tension, every eye glued to her, spectators leaning forward, the bailiff's boots scuffing the floor, the court reporter's fingers poised like a pianist waiting for the next chord. Pam's hands rested on her briefcase, but her mind was already miles ahead, weaving through decades of legal battles she'd fought and won. This wasn't about a necklace anymore. This was about a principle, a line crossed, a gauntlet she wasn't about to let lie unanswered. She straightened, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade honed by years of courtroom wars. Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to address this issue formally. Prescott's brow arched, a flicker of amusement, or maybe irritation, crossing his stony face. Address it, he said, glancing at the clock as if she were a child wasting his time. Miss Bondi, I'm sure you're aware this hearing is about a business dispute, not your personal grievances. His smirk was a dare, a silent bet that she'd back down. But Pam didn't blink. I'm also aware, she shot back, her tone ice-cold and razor-sharp, that the First Amendment doesn't take a recess for personal opinions. The words landed like a thunderclap, and for the first time, Prescott's composure faltered. Just a twitch, a narrowing of his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, fingers lacing together, as if to steady himself against the storm she'd just unleashed. The room was a pressure cooker now, every breath held, every heartbeat loud in the silence. Pam reached into her briefcase with the calm of a gunslinger drawing her weapon, pulling out a single sheet of paper and placing it on the table with deliberate care. She didn't rush. Every second she let stretch was a tightening of the noose around Prescott's argument. You're fining me for wearing a cross, claiming it violates courtroom neutrality, she said, her voice rising with the cadence of a preacher delivering a sermon no one could ignore. But tell me, Your Honor, what legal precedent are you basing that on? The question hung there, a challenge as old as the Constitution itself, daring him to answer. Prescott exhaled, a slow hiss of frustration, but he had no response, at least not yet. Pam tapped the paper, her eyes locked on his. Under the First Amendment, personal religious expression is protected, especially when it doesn't disrupt proceedings. He scoffed, a brittle sound. You're an attorney, not a law professor, he snapped. But it was weak, a deflection. Pam's smile was a blade, cold and unyielding. Then let's talk case law, shall we? She lifted the paper, her voice steady as she summoned the ghosts of American justice. Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969, a landmark case that ruled individuals don't shed their constitutional rights when they enter a government institution, whether it's a school or a courtroom. Prescott's jaw tightened. He knew Tinker. Every judge did. It was the kind of precedent that haunted men like him, men who thought their robes gave them unchecked power. Pam didn't stop. West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, 1943. The Supreme Court ruled that compelling individuals to remove or hide symbols of personal belief violates their First Amendment rights. She set the paper down, her gaze unrelenting. Now, Your Honor, would you like me to keep going? Or would you prefer to reconsider that fine? The room was electric. The spectators' whispers a low hum, the bailiff frozen in place. Prescott's fingers drummed against his chair, a telltale sign he was cornered. He wasn't just losing, he was being schooled, and everyone could see it. But Pam wasn't done dismantling him. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a steel-edged calm. You've allowed wedding bands in this courtroom. Half the attorneys here wear them. You've let government officials sport lapel pins, and I recall a defense attorney wearing a pink ribbon for breast cancer awareness during a trial. No objection from you then. A few gasps broke the silence, soft but sharp. She'd caught him in his own hypocrisy, and the weight of it pressed down on him like a collapsing roof. So why does this rule apply only to my cross? She asked, her words a quiet indictment that echoed louder than any shout. Prescott's face darkened, his pride a wounded beast thrashing for a way out. Enough, he barked, his voice a whip crack, but it couldn't mask the slip in his authority. Pam didn't budge. With all due respect, Your Honor, I'll stop when I receive a legal justification for this fine, because so far, I haven't heard one. The silence that followed was deafening, a standoff between a woman who'd built her life on fighting for what's right and a judge who'd mistaken his bench for a throne. Finally, Prescott broke, his voice low and grudging. Mark the fine as pending review, he muttered to the clerk. Pam smirked, a flicker of triumph in her eyes. I'll take that as a temporary victory, she said, but her tone promised more. The air was thick with the scent of a battle won, but not over. Prescott shifted in his seat, his expression unreadable, but the way his hands gripped the edge of his desk betrayed him. He'd expected compliance, a quick nod, a retreat. Instead, Pam had turned his courtroom into a stage and his ruling into a punchline. She adjusted her blazer, the gold cross still gleaming defiantly against her chest. Symbol not just of faith, but of a fight she'd never back down from. Outside, the world waited, oblivious for now, but not for long. Pam had drawn blood, and the wound she'd opened was about to bleed far beyond these walls. The gavel came down like a reluctant surrender, its thud reverberating through the Tampa courtroom as Judge Prescott dismissed the session. Pam Bondi gathered her papers with the same deliberate calm she'd wielded like a weapon moments before, the gold cross still resting against her chest, a quiet victor in a war that had only just begun. The spectators trickled out, their whispers buzzing like static, carrying the weight of what they'd witnessed beyond the heavy wooden doors. Pam felt it in her bones. This wasn't the end. Prescott's eyes had followed her as she left, a glint of something unspoken flickering in them, a challenge he hadn't voiced, but she knew was coming. She stepped into the humid Florida air, the sun glaring down as if it too demanded answers, and her mind was already racing ahead. Inside the courthouse, a reporter loitering in the hall caught the scent of a story. He'd been there for a dull tax case, but the murmurs from Prescott's courtroom were too juicy to ignore. A judge fining an attorney over a necklace? Within an hour, the local news site blazed with a headline that screamed across screens. Florida judge attempts to fine attorney for wearing a cross it doesn't go as planned. Pam's phone buzzed in her pocket as she slid into her car, the leather seat hot against her back. She ignored it at first, her thoughts still tangled in the clash she'd just won. But the buzzing didn't stop. Colleagues, law school classmates, a journalist she'd sparred with years ago. The notifications piled up like kindling ready to catch fire. She pulled into her office parking lot, a modest brick building that had seen her through countless late nights, and let the engine idle as she scrolled through the messages. Did this really happen? Prescott's lost it. You've got to tell me everything. Her lips twitched into a half smile, but it faded fast. This wasn't just gossip. It was a spark, and she knew how fast sparks could turn into infernos. She glanced at her client, a middle-aged business owner named Tom Hensley, who'd been the original reason for that hearing. He'd sat silent through the chaos, his gray eyes wide with a mix of awe and unease. Now, as he climbed out of his own car nearby, he gave her a nod, a small gesture, but it carried weight. He trusted her more now, saw her as more than just his lawyer. She was a fighter. Pam pushed through the glass doors of her office. The cool blast of air conditioning a stark contrast to the heat outside. Her assistant, Lauren, looked up from her desk, eyebrows raised. "You're already trending," she said, half joking, but Pam didn't laugh. She dropped her briefcase on a chair and sank into another, rubbing her temples. "It's not about me," she muttered, though she knew that wasn't entirely true anymore. The cross, the fine, the showdown. It was personal, yes, but it was bigger than her now. It was about every attorney who'd ever walked into a courtroom, every defendant who'd stood before a judge, every American who'd ever wondered where their rights began and a bureaucrat's whims ended. She turned on her phone again, the screen lighting up with more alerts. A conservative blog had picked up the story, framing her as a martyr for religious liberty. A legal forum was already dissecting Prescott's overreach. Her inbox pinged with a request from a national news producer. Pam exhaled, long and slow, the weight of it settling on her shoulders. She'd wanted a win, not a war, but wars don't wait for invitations. She thought of Prescott, the way he'd straightened his papers as she left, like a man trying to erase a mistake he couldn't unmake. He wasn't done with her. She'd seen it in his face, that flicker of defiance beneath the defeat. He'd lost the battle, but he'd be damned if he lost the narrative. Pam stood, pacing to the window that overlooked a quiet street lined with palms swaying in the breeze. Beyond this office, beyond Tampa, America was wrestling with itself. Courtrooms and classrooms, boardrooms and barrooms, all battlegrounds in a fight over who gets to define freedom. She'd just planted a flag in that fight, whether she'd meant to or not. Her victory over Prescott wasn't just a notch on her belt. It was a warning shot, a ripple that could become a wave. Would other judges try the same stunt? Would attorneys start stripping off their wedding rings, their tie clips, their identities, just to avoid a fine? Or would this embolden someone else to stand up, to say no when power overstepped? Her phone buzzed again. Lisa Reynolds, a journalist with a nose for judicial scandals. Pam didn't answer yet. She needed a plan, a way to turn this from a moment into a movement. She'd won in that courtroom, but the real fight was out here, in the open, where the stakes were higher and the audience was the whole damn country. Prescott thought he could slink away, lick his wounds, and come back swinging. He didn't know she was already reloading. The fluorescent lights in Pam Bondi's office buzzed faintly as she leaned against the window, the Tampa skyline a hazy silhouette against the late afternoon sun. Her phone sat silent now, but the weight of its earlier clamor lingered, a reminder that the world beyond these walls was watching, waiting, dissecting. She'd fired a shot across Prescott's bow, and the echoes were still reverberating when Lauren burst through the door, her face tight with urgency. "You need to see this," she said, thrusting a tablet into Pam's hands. The screen glowed with the Florida Bar Association's latest statement, a carefully worded jab dressed up as diplomacy. Judges have the right to maintain decorum in their courtrooms. While attorneys are afforded personal expression, it is important to respect the roles set forth by presiding judges. Pam's eyes narrowed, her pulse steady but her mind blazing. This wasn't a neutral comment. It was a battle line, and Prescott's fingerprints were all over it. She set the tablet down with a soft clack, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "He's not wasting time," she said, her voice low, threaded with steel. Lauren nodded, her lips pressed thin. "It dropped an hour ago. They don't usually move this fast unless someone's pulling strings." Pam didn't need to ask who. The legal world was a small pond, and Prescott was a big fish with a bruised ego. He'd lost in his own courtroom, had his authority shredded in front of witnesses, and now he was clawing it back through the system. The same system Pam had spent her career navigating, bending, breaking when she had to. She turned back to the window, arms crossed, the palms outside swaying like they were mocking her calm. This was retaliation, pure and simple, and it was coming fast. Lauren hesitated, then slid a printed document across the desk. "There's more," she said, her tone cautious, like she was handing Pam a live grenade. Pam skimmed the first lines, her breath catching for a split second before her lawyer's mask slammed back into place. Attorney Pamela Bondi conducted herself in a manner that disrupted courtroom proceedings, challenged judicial authority inappropriately, and engaged in behavior unbecoming of an officer of the court. A formal complaint, filed by Prescott himself, stamped with the weight of the Florida bar. She let out a short, bitter laugh, the sound cutting through the room like a blade. "Unbecoming?" she said, shaking her head. "That's rich." Lauren sighed, leaning against the desk. "It's retaliation, Pam. He's trying to flip the script, make you the villain, him the victim." Pam nodded, her fingers tapping the armrest of her chair, a restless rhythm of defiance. Prescott wasn't just licking his wounds. He was rewriting the story, painting himself as the noble judge disrespected by a reckless attorney. It was a classic move. Turn the accuser into the accused. Bury the real issue under a mountain of bureaucracy and sanctimonious jargon. But Pam saw through it like glass. He'd overreached with that fine, got called out, and now he was swinging back with the full weight of his office, hoping to crush her quietly behind closed doors. She wasn't about to let that happen. "What's the process on this?" she asked, shifting gears, her mind already mapping the terrain ahead. Lauren straightened, flipping through her notes. "You've got 10 days to respond. If it moves forward, they'll convene a panel, judges and senior attorneys, for a formal review." Pam's lips quirked, a ghost of a smile. A panel of Prescott's peers, some of whom probably owed him favors, others who'd nod along to protect their own. It was a stacked deck, but she'd played worse hands, and won. "He thinks I'll roll over," she said, more to herself than Lauren. "Take a reprimand, keep my head down, let it fade." Lauren studied her, waiting. "What do you want to do?" Pam took a deep breath, then reached for her phone, her fingers scrolling with purpose. "If Prescott wants to play games, let's play." She found Lisa Reynolds' number and hit call, the line ringing twice before that familiar voice crackled through. "Pam, I was just about to call you," Lisa said, her tone hungry, a journalist smelling blood. Pam didn't waste words. "Lisa, listen carefully. A judge just filed a complaint against me for disrupting his courtroom. But here's what really happened. He tried to fine me for wearing a cross, and when I stood my ground, he backed down. Now he's using the system to punish me instead." Lisa's sharp intake of breath was audible. "You're telling me a sitting judge is trying to sanction you because you called out his abuse of power?" Pam's smile was grim. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Lisa didn't hesitate. "I'm running this. Hard. Give me the green light, and it's live by tomorrow." Pam leaned forward, her voice steady. "I need it out there before they spin it. Once it's public, he can't bury it in some backroom hearing." Lisa was already moving. "I'll get legal analysts on it, ones who won't pull punches. This is big, Pam." The call ended, and Pam turned to Lauren, momentum building in her chest like a tide. "Draft a public statement," she said. "I want my side clear before Prescott's allies muddy the waters." Lauren grabbed her laptop, fingers poised. "You want to frame it as judicial overreach?" Pam shook her head, her eyes fierce. "Frame it as what it is, an attack on personal rights and an abuse of power. If he can punish me for standing up, imagine what he's done to people who don't have a voice." Lauren's expression hardened, a mirror to Pam's resolve. "I'll get it done." The room pulsed with the energy of a fight taking shape. Prescott thought he could silence her with paperwork, scare her with the threat of a stained record. He didn't understand who he was dealing with. Pam had spent decades in the trenches, prosecuting killers, defending the defenseless, staring down power, and making it blink. This wasn't a courtroom skirmish anymore. It was a war for the soul of justice, and she was about to take it to the streets, the airwaves, the people. Outside, the palms still swayed, but the breeze carried a whisper of change, a storm brewing that Prescott couldn't outrun. The storm broke overnight, a deluge of headlines and hot takes flooding the airwaves as Pam Bondi's office hummed with the aftershocks. She sat at her desk, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, the bitter aroma grounding her as her phone lit up like a 4th of July sky. Lisa Reynolds had kept her word. Her segment aired at dawn, a blistering takedown of Prescott's overreach that ricocheted across networks and social media. The headline was everywhere, blazing in bold. Florida judge attempts to punish attorney for wearing a cross. Now he's under fire. Pam scrolled through the chaos, her lips pressed tight, not in fear, but in focus. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a bonfire, and the country was throwing fuel on it. Twitter was a battlefield. Hashtags like @CrossInCourt and Taj Prescott, overreach, trending as voices clashed. This is why we need the First Amendment, see? One user roared, while another sneered. Judges should keep order, not coddle egos. Legal analysts piled in, their faces stern on cable news panels. A Georgetown constitutional lawyer tore into Prescott live on CNN, his voice a hammer. This has no legal standing. It's a blatant abuse of discretion. A high-profile attorney posted a thread on X, dissecting how Pam's stand had exposed a crack in the system, a precedent that could haunt courtrooms nationwide if left unchecked. Pam's inbox overflowed. Support from allies, outrage from strangers, a flood of noise she barely had time to sift through. Lauren burst in, her phone aloft like a trophy. "You're going to want to see this," she said, pressing play on a clip that froze Pam mid-sip. The Florida Judicial Review Board's logo flashed across the screen, followed by a stiff-necked spokesperson. "Due to significant public attention, we will review Judge Alan Prescott's conduct to determine if his actions violated judicial ethics." Pam set her mug down, the clink loud in the sudden silence. Lauren smirked, arms crossed. They didn't waste time. Pam nodded, a slow burn of satisfaction in her chest. This wasn't just media chatter now. It was official, a reckoning Prescott couldn't dodge. The board's move was a spotlight, and he was squirming under it. Across town, the judge himself faced the music. Cameras flashed outside the courthouse as he stepped onto the steps, his face a mask of forced calm, his robe swapped for a suit that couldn't hide the stiffness in his shoulders. The press swarmed, mics thrust forward, voices overlapping. "Judge Prescott, why the fine? Are you targeting Bondi?" He raised a hand, his voice clipped, rehearsed. "I have always upheld the integrity of this courtroom. The actions taken were in the interest of maintaining neutrality. I respect the judicial review process and will cooperate fully." It was short, too short for a man trying to defend his honor, and the crowd knew it. A reporter shouted, "Neutrality or bias?" But Prescott turned away, disappearing back inside as the question hung unanswered. Pam watched the clip loop on Lauren's phone, her coffee cooling as she dissected his words. "Neutrality?" she muttered, almost laughing. "He's still clinging to that?" Lauren snorted. "He's trying to save face, and failing." Pam leaned back, her eyes tracing the ceiling. Prescott's statement was a flimsy shield, and it was cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. His credibility was bleeding out, his authority unraveling with every replay. The man who'd fined her over a cross, who'd tried to bury her with a complaint, was now the one on trial. Not in a courtroom, but in the court of opinion, where verdicts hit harder and lingered longer. The momentum was hers now, a tidal wave she'd set in motion with that first defiance. She'd wanted to protect her rights, but this was bigger. Every attorney who'd ever faced a judge's whim, every citizen who'd wondered if their voice mattered. They were in this fight too. The Judicial Review Board's decision loomed, a sword over Prescott's head. If they ruled against him, it'd be more than embarrassment. It'd be a legal scar, a precedent that said power doesn't get to trample freedom without consequence. Even if they let him off, he'd lost where it counted. His name was mud, his bench a punchline. Every lawyer who walked into his courtroom from now on would know. He'd tried to silence Pam Bondi, and he'd failed spectacularly. She took a slow sip of her coffee, the bitterness a match for the fire in her gut. The phone buzzed again, another producer, another interview request, but she let it sit. This wasn't about fame or headlines. It was about a line in the sand, a stand that had turned a spark into a blaze. Prescott had underestimated her, thought he could flex his power and watch her fold. Now, the whole country was watching him squirm, and Pam wasn't just winning, she was rewriting the rules of the game. The buzz of Pam Bondi's phone finally dulled to a low hum as she sat back in her office chair, the late morning light slanting through the blinds and casting jagged shadows across her desk. The coffee in her mug had gone cold, but she took another sip anyway, savoring the bitter edge as it mirrored the quiet fire still smoldering in her chest. Lauren lingered by the door, her smirk fading into something softer, pride maybe, or just the relief of a battle won. The clip of Prescott's flimsy courthouse defense still looped in Pam's mind, his stiff posture and hollow words, a ghost she couldn't shake. He'd tried to play the martyr, but the country wasn't buying it. The Judicial Review Board's investigation hung over him like a storm cloud, and his reputation was already a casualty, shredded not by a gavel, but by the unrelenting roar of a public that had seen enough. Pam set the mug down, her fingers tracing its rim as she let the weight of it all settle. She'd walked into that Tampa courtroom days ago, expecting a routine fight, not a war that would spill onto national screens and sear itself into the American psyche. The gold cross still hung against her chest, a quiet testament to the stand she'd taken, a stand that wasn't just hers anymore. She thought of the attorneys texting her support, the strangers flooding her inbox with gratitude, the legal analysts who'd turned her defiance into a rallying cry. This wasn't about a necklace or a fine. It was about power, about who gets to wield it and who gets to push back when it oversteps. She'd pushed hard, and the cracks in Prescott's armor were now a chasm he couldn't climb out of. Lauren broke the silence, her voice cutting through Pam's reverie. "We won," she said, a statement more than a question, her eyes bright with the certainty of it. Pam met her gaze, a slow smile tugging at her lips. "Oh, I know," she replied, the words carrying the weight of a victory that stretched beyond this room. She stood, pacing to the window, where the palms outside bent gently in the breeze, a world oblivious to the seismic shift she'd just triggered. Prescott's name would echo in legal circles for years, not as a pillar of justice, but as a cautionary tale. Every attorney who faced him now would carry her story like a shield, a reminder that power doesn't bend the unbroken. She turned back to her desk, the chaos of her phone a distant hum now. The fight had been hers at first, a personal line crossed, a right defended, but it had grown into something louder, something that thundered through courtrooms and living rooms alike. She hadn't just beaten Prescott, she'd exposed him, stripped his authority bare, and handed it to the people to judge. The Judicial Review Board might slap his wrist or let him slink away, but it didn't matter. His loss was etched in the public's memory, a wound that wouldn't heal with a press release or a quiet retirement. Pam had sent a message, not with a whisper but with a roar. Never let power strip you down without a fight, because one voice, one stand, can shift the whole damn tide. The phone pinged again, a colleague, a friend, someone else caught in the wake, but Pam let it sit. She didn't need the validation. She'd spent years in the trenches, fighting for clients, for justice, for a system that didn't always fight back. This time, she'd fought for herself, and in doing it, she'd lit a spark for everyone else. The palms outside swayed on, the sun climbed higher, and Pam Bondi stood taller, knowing she'd changed the game, not just for her, but for every soul brave enough to stand their ground.